Today's material is taken from Chapter 10 in Essentials of Nursing Research by Polit and Beck. We previously have discussed the who, that is the sample of a specific study, which is drawn from a population of interest for our research. Today we're going to discuss the what, which is the data that we collect for our research. And our first decision is, are we going to use original data or are we going to use existing data? This is important as we interpret the strengths and limitation of data collection techniques in our understanding of quantitative and qualitative research designs. It matters because the RA needs to consider the value of a given published research for their practice, and they need to make that decision based on the strengths and limitations of a particular research design. So this discussion of the type of data that's collected occurs in the methods section of the research report. So using our IMRAD format, this discussion of data collection methods is listed in the methods section of the research report. All of these methods have strengths and limitations. If you use existing data, you may choose something that's historical, such as perhaps the water quality records of a given town or community, and then you may analyze those and lay them alongside different waterborne illnesses. And this would be one method of using a historical data in order to make a research claim. The other thing that we do is a secondary analysis. So a study could be done with a large data set, and then we want to look at another smaller question that could be asked of that data. This is called secondary analysis. We've spent a lot of time talking about the difference between a secondary analysis of data and a secondary source, which describes the research article itself as being a secondary source, which is a compilation of research discussion and a research study itself. A secondary analysis is actually a data collection method that is used in a research study, which is different from the secondary source. Finally, the meta-analysis, which we've also discussed, is a compilation of study findings into one report. So they take multiple studies, all of whom studied the same kind of issue, and combine them into a new meta-analysis report. So these are the different methods that we will be looking at today. No matter what kind of data we collect, the important thing is to consider the structure of that data, how quantifiable it is, and how objective it is. This is very important to especially quantitative studies. Now, qualitative studies and these quantitative, are also looking at the depth or the honesty, truthfulness, and trustworthiness of data that has been collected. And in the qualitative tradition, in the quantitative tradition, we're looking for reproducibility, if we could get the same answer every time, which is a different kind of validity and reliability than that trustworthiness that is used to evaluate data in a qualitative tradition. So let's start with our second form. So our first form of data, if you remember, was historical data or data that had been existing. Now our second form is self-report methods. So we're going to look at those different methods for self-report. First of all, there can be unstructured techniques. These are most common, again, in qualitative research. They're flexible, conversational, and they can be focused on a single topic or a very broad topic. They can be done with groups or individuals. You can also use people's life histories or diaries, and all of these are methods of self-report. we can also use a structured self-report, which is more common actually in quantitative research, because they use a instrument which is a collection of prepared questions, and they may ask the person to fill those out. They may ask a very open-ended question, such as what led you to decide to stop smoking, and then the researcher records the person's response in their own words. So this would be, all of these are done with the subject's own words. Now, secondly, there can be close-ended. This is much more quantitative in nature. Yes, no questions, multiple choice, the select all that apply. We can put things in order, so you can write on cards. How would you prefer to have your labor and delivery go? And we can take all the different kinds of interventions we have and have a someone participating in the research, put those cards in order from what they most would like or least would like. And that's one method of doing research. And we can also force people to make choices and use rating questions. It's very important how we structure questions, whether they be in questionnaires, in scales, in interviews, because how those questions are formed influences the response that we receive. This includes the reading level. Most questionnaires need to be written at a 3rd or 4th grade reading level. They should be short enough that people do not become fatigued with it and then just start giving random answers that really have nothing to do with their beliefs and everything to do with wanting to get done with the questionnaire. So it's very important to use neutral wording and avoid ambiguous questions. Double-barreled questions use and or double negatives in questions. So here's some questions with some problems. Don't you agree that abortion is wrong? So here we've got a problem with multiple negatives. So we've got don't, wrong, and agree. So the way this question is worded, not only is it somewhat of a leading question, it has all kinds of negative and positives in it that could make it confusing for your participant. Here's one: should men enter the nursing profession, and should we offer incentives to encourage them? Notice these are 2 separate questions, and a participant could say yes to one and no to the second, or no to the first and yes to the second. So we need to be careful with that formatting of that question. And here's another one that's a problem. This is ambiguous because a person who's been an RN for 5 years could answer A or B, 10 years, B or C. So we need to be careful how questions are formed. In addition, once data is collected, we want to be sure it's handled correctly. It should not be coded incorrectly or entered wrong. We need to make sure definitions are consistent throughout the document. And all of these can lead to problems with data. Let's look at the issues between questionnaires and interviews. Questionnaires have many strengths. They're less costly, they take less effort. You can get a sample of people from all over the world thanks to the internet, and people can answer with anonymity. And also, they don't see you as a person when they're completing a questionnaire, so that they do not need to please the person who's delivering that, which is called interview bias. The positives are that you get a high not with a questionnaire, with an interview. On the other hand, the positives are that you can get a very high response rate. People who cannot fill out a questionnaire, don't have a computer, in an interview, they will usually participate with you to the end. There's less chance for misinterpretation of the data, because when someone says something, you can clarify it in an interview setting, and you can also ask them to describe further. So this gives a lot more information. So the strengths of interviews outweigh the strengths of questionnaires. And the response rate being high is definitely a benefit. I have a student right now who is sending out a questionnaire to 17,000 people, and we're hoping to get about 200 responses. So that shows you how low the response rate is when sending out questionnaires. Interviews, on the other hand, are very timely to set up and can be challenging that way. So in addition to that often can be used in either an interview or in a questionnaire are these different kind of special scales. And these are ways of giving a self-report. The most important one that you probably have been exposed to is called a Likert scale. And there's declarative statements that express a view, and the respondents asked to what degree they agree or disagree with that, and they choose one of these 5 categories. I've also seen these done with 7 levels, but 5 is the most common. It's always an odd number. And so Likert scales are a very important way that we collect data. Notice here, we can also do a scale that has a bipolar adjective. So good, that says God, but it should say good and bad, cold and warm, responsible, irresponsible. And then the individual fills that out from the 1 to 7 with their response with those characteristics. Notice how this one, 7, the competent is a 7 and the valuable is a 7. The important would be the 7, the pleasant is a 7, good would be a 7. I don't know warm and cold where they would put that, but I tend to think of warm as the 7. So once again, the way you code these is important to the results that you get. The visual analog scale you should be familiar with because we use this as a pain scale often. This is when a scale is presented to a person visually and then they mark it somewhere along this 100 millimeter scale. They mark if they have no pain or pain as severe as possible. Then they put a line there, they mark that, and then the researcher goes ahead and measures and decides how many millimeters from the end was that mark. And so it's a very accurate method of measuring a subjective experience. It's a visual analog scale. So these can also be done with groups or individuals. So they can be done verbally or in writing. And okay, speaking of writing, I'm trying to clear all drawings. Okay. Then the other thing that we can see here, there's all kinds of characteristics that can be given: comfort level, affect, vulnerability, stress. And so you can say, I look at to determine my level of self-esteem. So here is basically a theory, a concept, self-esteem, and then there's different constructs within that these researchers are measuring. Now, here's a problem with any of these self-report measures, and that is people will tend to respond to be socially desirable. So that means they want to respond in a way that they're viewed positively. People also tend to use the extremes, like they will tend to use all good, 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 and then even if they don't have an extreme view, they tend to turn everything into a 2-point scale instead of a 5-point scale. And respondents will tend to agree with all the questions that have a positive connotation. And then what you can do to balance these biases is by counterbalancing. That slide we had previously here, for example, it counterbalances by putting them on opposite sides. This one also will have positive and negative directions. Note, here's a positively written statement, here's a negatively written statement, and that's called counterbalancing. And so by counterbalancing, we can eliminate some of the response set bias that people have, or at least identify it. Here's a third method of self-report. In this case, we give a story. So we might say, which of the following 6 RNs, which of these pictures is the RN most professional? And then we would, the person would select someone. They probably would select this person because they have more stripes and on their cap, for example. And then you would ask people, why did you do that? And they would say something like that. And we don't know if these are valid responses or not, but they do enable a unique response to a specific question. So self-report has a lot of strengths. It's direct. It's especially important if we want to know about people's feelings or what they believe. So that's some of the bigger strengths of this kind of self-report. But of course, we have a little more difficulty knowing how accurate and valid the self-reports are. And so because of that, you should be just be looking at how the researchers controlled for response bias in self-report types of data. All right. You won't often see all the information you'd like to about how the self-reports were collected, but there will be some information. And so what we look at, for example, is the response rate. A high response rate is desirable. And who administered the questions. We want to be sure that people are trained and what kind of structure and format were done in our critique of self-report methods. All right, here we are, number 3, observation methods. These are very common in nursing research, and I'm currently doing some of these. There's unstructured methods where you just gain trust into the setting and observe. This is very common in qualitative research, and then you write what are called field notes about whatever you observed about that experience that you had. Those are unstructured. Then there's also structured observations, and in these you might have a more prepared form or a better, a more detailed plan, not necessarily better, but a detailed plan of how to quantify. For example, in my current study, I decided that at the two-week point in my study, I would observe to see how many second grade students remained in the cafeteria versus how many were in my Mornings in Motion study. So I just went with a checklist and counted the number of students that were second graders in the cafeteria week 2, and did that again every day at exactly 7:30. So I had both the time for the observation and how I was going about it so that I could have consistency across that week in measuring my participation. So you can also use rating scales, and you can record the number of behaviors that you see qualitatively. You can write notes about that. You can observe at specific kinds of events, like my observational sampling of any injury. I would report that as an event and include those. So just know there are many kinds of structured observations that you can make. So some of the things, the strengths, nursing, we are observers. That's what we do. We assess situations, we observe, and that is a strength of this method. In many situations, this is a very appropriate form of research, but there can be ethical controversies. For example, especially if a researcher doesn't report all the things that they are actually observing about a situation, if that other people might feel kind of duped if they thought someone was their friend and they were really not being a friend, they were really being an observer for a research purpose. And then observations, another weakness is that our inherent bias that colors everything that we see. So when we look at the research methods, then we're asking about, is it appropriate structure? Was the focus correct? Were there any concealments which may indicate an ethical issue? Did we have a systematic form to do our observations and what was that plan. And now we have our fourth measure, which is biophysiological measures. And this is often a very, very comfortable form for nursing to be involved in. So you could use this to describe nursing actions, to evaluate the response to nursing action, for example. Like you could do this with a response to blood pressure medication. What if medication's given with food or without food? How does a person's blood pressure respond to that? With water, how do people swallow? You might look at how many coughs people give when they swallow from a water bottle versus a cup. So that would be a physiological response to a nursing action. Evaluation to a nursing procedure. If you lay someone on their side to train to dressing, is there less pain response than the same dressing change done with the same person in a different position? So we commonly are measuring blood pressure in response to various activities, temperature. All of these are measures that we're very comfortable doing as an RN. And then there's two types of biophysical. The one is performed on living organisms, and the other is on in the laboratory, which is called in vitro, and then in vivo, which in vivo's living, in vitro is the laboratory study. There's a lot of different methods that can be used, and so what we want to know, these biophysical data that we have are usually considered accurate and objective, valid, and that we have the equipment accessible to do them. But some people may not perform the measure the same way twice, such as blood pressure. Maybe they don't use the right size cuff. Perhaps people haven't been trained to do it. Some of these measures may be invasive and less pragmatic to do. So although the data is generally considered more valid, there are reasons why we might not use some biophysiological methods. And we have to make sure that the method we use actually targets the variable we want to study. For example, pain. Pain is best studied subjectively. So using people's heart rate or blood pressure as a near measure for pain is not as good as using the subjective measure with the visual analog scale. So that's an example where you have to look at what the target variable is and not use just a near biophysical marker is still not as good as the target variable itself. So something to watch out for. And like I mentioned, the skill of the collector, I was in a study and I noticed that people were using the wrong size blood pressure cuff. And because of that bad instrument, basically, their data was rendered inappropriate, even though they had, or invalid. It invalidated the data that they collected. So today, you introduced the strengths and condensations of 4 categories of data collection techniques, and you can identify the type of data reported in a study as belonging to one of those 4 categories, I hope, and you can interpret appropriately the application of this in evidence-based practice on data collection techniques. So be thinking about the data that was collected related to its validity and reliability for the study at hand. Thanks for hanging out with me. Take care.